Again, if you are joining us, welcome. This is the Dynamo Office Hours Community Conversations, and I think we can get this ball rolling. So for those of you who might be new, these are the Autodesk Community Conversations. Basically what we do here is we get the Autodesk community together with expert speakers from both the community and also from experts here within Autodesk to basically share knowledge and make connections and have a conversation with you all. This is just our safe harbor statement. Just take a minute or so to kind of read over this. Basically, it just states that any forward-looking statements based on new information, features, future events, or anything like that cannot be or should not influence your purchasing and things like that. Just quickly before we begin, this is a community conversation. We like to hear from you guys. Saul and Jacob do have a presentation, but we'd like to hear from you, have you guys ask questions as we're going along and things like that. To do so, you can either interact with reactions, which is down in the right-hand corner of your Zoom, or either that you can raise your hand, come off mute, whatever it might be. Feel free to utilize the chat. We are monitoring it as well so that we can get this conversation going. The session is being recorded. It is currently recording right now, and it will be posted to the Community Conversations event page, which is where you went to register for this event, as well as on YouTube. And I will hand it over to Jacob and Saul.
Hey, so welcome everybody. My name is Jacob Small. I'm an implementation consultant based out of Stockholm, Sweden. Describe myself as a Dynamo form junkie. You'll catch me doing Dynamo at all hours of the day. So,
all right. Hello, everyone. My name is Saul. I'm a product manager working on Dynamo. Describe myself as a curious human being. Currently live in Boston, but from New Zealand originally. So, say anything that doesn't make sense, shout out and poke me or something. All right, so let's kick this one off. So as Tiana said, this is a conversation, so please, please, please do chat with us in the chat or coming off mute. We love it, we really do. We like being interrupted. We live for being interrupted in this particular series, actually. So anything that doesn't quite make sense to you or that you want to learn more about, or even some completely side tangential question, we also encourage those too, on the context or topic of Dynamo, of course, given this is our Dynamo Office Hours series. So this is session number 49 in the series called Taming the Dynamo Chaos. And we will be doing what we usually do here, which is essentially a roughly 20-minute presentation. This might be slightly shorter today. Then we're going to jump into a live demonstration with today's very broken spaghetti graph that we're going to look to try and fix. And we're going to use some of the tools available in Dynamo to help you do that. And as always, there will be a bit of a Q&A at the end, but we do encourage that to be scattered throughout. All right, so Jake and I are going to sort of flip-flop on different slides. This one is mine. We're going to start here. So a little bit about the why and the what. My token of a perfectionist dream, or for the OCD in me, at least, and maybe in some of you, chaotic graphs are a problem. And they're a problem for many different reasons. Some of those reasons being time sinks for both other people and your future self, potentially. If you create a graph that does really amazing things, and then you kind of forget what it does, or you come back to it later, or you try to give it to someone else, it's going to be a lot harder for that other person to actually make any edits or changes to that graph if they don't know what's going on. So today's session also includes ways to help annotate and sort of solve some of those problems. We have touched upon this in previous sessions in Dynamo Office Hours as well, so do go and check those out. Clearly organized information is essentially much easier to understand than chaotic information, which is kind of, common sense, but it really does hold true in the context of Dynamo. So if you want to be able to read your graph as you're building it, it helps. If you want to read it after a little break, it helps. And if you want to read it sometime in the future, it helps even more. So documenting your graphs really does do wonders for not just what you're doing, but also explaining the rationale behind choices that you make, the why and the what. So singular nodes in the context of Dynamo can do many different things. And so to try and piece together the logic of a flow of data through a graph just by the nodes themselves is entirely possible. And many of you do it, I'm sure, but it has helped a lot by having notes about the intent of why you're trying to do those things in the first place. And in this case, from Dynamo 213 onwards, you can actually tether those nodes to nodes as well and pin them, which is kind of cool. And if you're looking to have a really robust, large-scale script library, which I know some people on the call do manage, the only real way to scale Dynamo is to have sort of rich annotation practices and really good sharing and dependency practices too. Because when things do go wrong, and this is life, when things go wrong from time to time, you will want to be able to resolve them, to be able to unlock that power and potential of what that graph is doing again.
Yeah, and I'll weigh in here. It really is important to make sure that you're documenting what that logic is, in particular when you're trying to work with others. About once every other day, I get a message with, hey, my Dynamo graph's not working. Can you help walk me through fixing it? And I'll jump on a Zoom call with a colleague or somebody that I'm working with in my consulting role, and we'll start to look at the graph and be like, well, what was it that you were thinking here? Why were you stringing these nodes the way that you were? And I get that they're working, we don't see an error, but I'm not sure where you were going with this. And very often the answer is, oh, I'm not entirely sure. And so really by taking the time to put that logic down, build the map before you start to build your graph, and then make sure that map logic actually flows through the graph as well, will really save you a lot of time in the long haul. So when I do get those calls every other day or so, sometimes more often, sometimes less, what do I do? Well, I always recommend starting with the big picture first. Confirm that logic flow. Make sure that things are working from left to right. Make sure you understand what the intent of the graph was, right? Look into the pinned notes, look into the groups, and just do a quick sort of once over. Once that's done, we want to tackle the errors next, right? Any node that's in an error state is going to have big problems. The most common error state is usually you're missing a package or you're in the wrong Dynamo context. So resolving those two things is usually pretty quick. Install the right package or open the right version of Dynamo, be it, I don't know, Dynamo for Revit instead of Dynamo Sandbox or something along those lines. After that, start working on your warnings from left to right. So in the case of the graph here, now we've kind of gone over everything, we can sort of quickly identify the flow. There's a bunch of standalone nodes up here that we probably don't need to worry about. Node 1 leads to 2, 3, 4, 5, and some more standalone nodes. Now those standalone nodes might actually be doing stuff that's really important. So we got to make sure we address any warnings or errors that are on those before progressing to the larger string. So all of that said, which is the first thing that I would tackle if I was to receive a graph that looked like this? Well, I'd start down there, figure out exactly why those nodes are in an error state, go through and figure out what's sort of putting them into that piece, make sure we resolve all of those first. After that, the next node that I would look at is this one. And then we're going to march consecutively across the way as we resolve those warnings. Note that most often that warning that you're going to see, currently the first one in the string being 6, usually the problem is actually in the node just before that, not in the node itself. The functions in Dynamo being sort of pre-coded, pre-compiled, can't really work with, it's not like the pointed parameter node is suddenly going to work differently in this particular context, or it shouldn't anyways, knock on wood. So usually that issue is going to be the node just beforehand. So we want to check that closely. And in this case, you can see that node currently labeled number 5 is actually feeding a value of infinity, which is usually not going to process very well for subsequent nodes. Yeah, so that's pretty much that. Oh yeah, make sure as you're going through, and resolving these, oftentimes when it is a node where the node's broken, it's going to be a custom node. Go ahead and pop the custom node open, pull the contents out of the custom node, put it on canvas, find out where the error is. But once a week, I see somebody saying, hey, this Dynamo for Revit node, custom node is no longer working. What's wrong with it? And you tell them, open it up, copy paste the contents in, run it there, and okay, yes, it doesn't account for the units changes or the element ID changes or whatever else it might have inside the Python. so we can get to that and fix that pretty quick. When that does happen, if you don't know entirely how to resolve the contents of the custom node, just try a different node which does something similar. A lot of times there's something in Archilab or Rhythm that you can pull from to make it work, or switch to an out-of-the-box node if possible. And if you're really stuck, feel free to reach out for some help on the Dynamo forum or elsewhere.
Yeah, and one fun fact is if you do want to create infinity in Dynamo, it's very easy. You just do 1 divided by 0 in a code block. Not that it's practically useful anywhere, but it is fun.
It's one of my favorite outputs for generative design.
All right, so also we're talking about things like packing the right equipment. In this case, workspace references and dependency management. We're going to touch upon this briefly here. So workspace references, if you're not familiar, I suspect most of you probably are, is an extension that we have in Dynamo that logs references into your file. So what is a reference? A reference is something that is not actually bound within the graph itself. So you can consider things like packages as references, which is why we have a package section. If you look at the upper right, this is where every single package that you install inside of Dynamo that has a node that is used within a particular graph will show up here either with a tick, which means it's all working great, with a red X, which means, you have a graph that you've opened that doesn't, or that is using a node from a package that you do not currently have installed, with a yellow exclamation mark, which gives you the option to either choose the version that ships with the graph or the version you have installed, because there's a difference between them. So we also have the ability to, and they serialize these into Dynamo graphs. So Dynamo's graphs understands exactly what package and what version is being used within that graph to ensure that it works correctly, providing you have the actual package installed. Beyond that, we have what we call local definitions and external files. Local definitions is in essence a package or a DLL or a custom node that is only on your local desktop, not actually downloaded from the package manager. So this could be something that your office uses in an intranet. It could be something local to yourself, and so on. And then external files is everything else that Dynamo refers into itself. So this is things like Excel documents and JPEG files and other DLLs and a bunch of other random file format things that Dynamo wants to talk to at any point in time. So what Dynamo will do will serialize these things, which means essentially save it into the DYN file, both the version and the item itself. And then it will tell you and automatically pop up when you have a graph open that needs a package you don't have, which is kind of cool. All of the external things, so local definitions and external files, are things you have to manage yourself. So when you want to give this graph to somebody else, they need to have access to the same things you do to run that graph in the same way. And currently, we don't have any tooling beyond a previous pack and go experience in generative design that actually bundles those together, but it is something we're kicking around for the future. And one thing to note is that sometimes things can get out of sync with installed packages requiring a replacement of nodes. Typically, this is when you have installed a later version and the graph is using an earlier version of a package and it's trying to somehow self-solve and it's getting halfway through the way and getting a bit confused. And those very rare occurrences, you should be able to replace the nodes with the version that you want to keep, which in this case might be the more older version, and understand that replacing those nodes is going to solve all those issues. So hopefully you don't run into those. And if it's common for you, please let us know because we want to fix it. But hopefully they're rare occurrences. And then other things to bear in mind, that there's other dependencies that you can manage in various different ways. So you can have cloud locations, like syncing from things like OneDrive, or 360, or Autodesk Docs. You can use things like data.remember nodes down in the lower right, which is a way to serialize data directly into the Dynamo graph. So this is a case of pulling something in from Revit, and those nodes are in warning states, which Jacob just talked about. They're actually also unresolved nodes because Dynamo Sandbox doesn't understand the Revit API and can't tell what's going on. It cannot be resolved, but the data remember node does still have the salient data from them that we can work with in a different context. So it's kind of bundling that stuff up, the good stuff, keeping it and letting you work with it elsewhere. In this case, this is kind of like a bundled sidecar inside of the Dynamo graph, but you can also sidecar those files in the same directory as your graph and access them through things like Python with relative directory paths.
Next thing to keep in mind is data errors. These are pretty common. It's sort of the example of, I've built a graph that uses curve point a parameter, and the user, instead of selecting an element whose geometry returns a curve, they selected an element whose geometry returns a mesh. That's not going to be quite so helpful for curve.pointerParameter, and so we're going to see some errors. Now, there are a few different things that you can do to sort of prevent those kind of problems. In the case of a mesh, the most common thing that returns a mesh in Revit is actually our topography. So we could actually prevent selecting the wrong type using select by category or select filter by category. There's a couple different options for that. We've also got different sort of means of controlling inputs. We can pre-filter. We'll talk more about that in a few. It's also important to keep in mind that values out of range can also impact things. So if somebody's saying, get the point at segment length 300 feet and the curve is only 50 feet long, well, there's no point at 300 feet, so that's going to error out as well. So keep that in mind as you go and build some sort of checks into this. Now, when in doubt, you can always add an informing pop-up. This is something that I had built ages ago. There's a Dynamo form link down at the bottom. I think this was one of my first ever Dynamo forum posts, so I really like to celebrate it. Back in February of 2017, I said, hey, I've got this Python. It does what I needed to do, but it's not working in the context of Dynamo. Why? And Guy Tillerico actually came through and let me know I had to add my system path in. Conveniently, we no longer have to worry about adding that system path. We can just import C types and go. C types is pretty quick in order to implement. As you can see, it's just one little line of Python, ctypes.windll.user32.messageboxw, open our parentheses, 0, comma, whatever we want the message to be, comma, whatever we want the title to be, comma 1, and close those parentheses, and that will get you your message. So if we've got the wrong type of data, this will pop up. If we are expecting a coordinate system and we got something else, this will pop up that information. There are other ways to trigger this more robustly. You can do stuff like the Revit API has some great messages. You could use WinForms to get more robust messaging. There are also ways you can sort of limit what people can select and do selection through selection. Data shapes, UI++ nodes have great ways to sort of filter that stuff as you go. So definitely worth keeping in mind as you're building up those graphs, in particular if you're seeing yes, task dialog.show in the Revit API. In particular, if you're seeing users generating errors where they've selected the wrong kind of content, that's when we want to look into this kind of stuff.
All right, cool. So, no, this isn't broken. We have a bunch of ways to handle nodal error handling inside of the graph. And this is just going to sort of explain a couple of them. And the handling happens at sort of different severity levels. Something, for example, like the list clean node is a way for you to handle data that may be coming through in weird ways. So list.clean, which is shown in blue in the lower right here, allows you to essentially clean up your data from things that you might not want. In this case, null values, which means nothings, and empty lists. So in the context of Revit, if you're pulling in data, you're probably going to run into nulls and nothings very often. If you're on Sandbox, maybe not so much. Jacob can probably let me know if Civil 3D runs into these same problems. I'm unsure, not very much an expert on that front. But in essence, having clean data at the front end of your graph by using, say, a list clean technique or some of the other ones Jacob's going to talk about in the next slide are going to help you with having a more simple to understand and easy to use graph downstream. So we've also touched upon it a little bit right now. The errors, which showcase in red, are fundamental elements of your graph that are broken, and they really need fixing because your graph is literally not going to execute the way it was intended without them. Typically, as touched upon already, these are missing packages, deprecated nodes, or missing DLLs. The context is not understanding, or something has literally been missed. Some files have been deleted or not shipped with it in this case. Yellow warnings, which we have a couple on screen here, are really important bits of information for you as a graph author to understand and do with what you will. So some of those are warnings that say something's broken and not working. Some of them are ignorable, and you can ignore them by using something like either a suppression through function apply, which is function passing. And do note that function passing is a feature that may not stand the test of time, given it actually has some performance degradation issues associated with it. But for the time being, it lives and it breathes here in Dynamo. And we would do some kind of mapping to change those nodes. Should we change that? But function passing can be used here to suppress warnings. So you'll notice in the upper corner, we selected 2 elements. We have a floor, we have a custom family. And if we're trying to pull the geometry from that custom family, we're getting an error, or sorry, a warning in this case, that says some stuff is kind of failing. And like, we might be totally cool with that. Maybe it's totally fine that that stuff is failing. We don't care, but we don't want to freak people out with a warning. So we might want to suppress it. If we use function apply and we add that element.geometry node in a function state, which means it doesn't have an input connected into it, and you'll notice it has a little gray bar on the output, it's going to essentially suppress that warning, which, by the way, is a bug technically, but has now been around for so long, it's kind of a feature. So it is what it is. Then, but use that cautiously, because as we noted in the previous bullet point, warnings are important and they tell us really useful information. And we really do want to have a graph that gives us all the information to be able to make the best, most informed decisions. The last thing we can do here is also, if we want to, temporarily dismiss warnings, which is shown in the CN here, which any warning that pops up has a dismiss button, and that dismiss button is then going to showcase on the node with a little icon and a counter inside of it. Do note that these do not persist between sessions today. The original intention was to do that, but the way of suppressing warnings is very granular, which means you have to actually create the warning in the first place to dismiss it. And maybe you want to categorically guard against different kinds of warnings and suppress the ones that you know are not an issue. And we don't have a good design for that yet. So if anyone has any bright ideas, please do say, yeah, I'd love to hear them. It's a little difficult because our warnings come from many different places, like our geometry kernel, and gets bubbled up in the case of the one in yellow here, using curve off surface and so on.
Yeah, and I'll weigh in a little bit on the function apply to suppress warnings. As useful as that is, again, do so sparingly. If you do use it, make sure that we've got some additional sort of checking beforehand to make sure we are handling like it was expecting a floor, but it got a topography as an example, right? Where we might have been using floors for sidewalks and somebody converted hadn't converted the topo surface to a floor yet, and we were working with the topo itself. In those cases, obviously the element geometry node will throw a bit of a warning if you were to pull that around large coordinates or around, hey, can't get the mesh, got to use a special node for that, so on and so forth. And by not suppressing that, I've actually seen entire Revit models basically get nuked because someone was like, oh, we've suppressed this. It's going to go ahead and it's going to grab the floors. It's going to adjust the points, and then it's going to delete make a new floor element, and then it's going to delete the objects. And they had everything done through function passing. Everything was gone when they were done. They just synced. It was running in the background, and before you know it, it's just warnings everywhere the next time somebody went to open their Revit model. So be real careful with using function apply. Warnings are oftentimes your best friend. All right, so now how do we find the troublesome bits? Well, the easiest way visually is probably just to leverage the zoom states. So you can see here we've got our warnings in yellow, errors in red, info states in blue, previews off in gray, and frozen in ice blue. Now, do note that sometimes when you're zooming in and out, you may see that there's occasionally a zoom state that's not going to sort of refresh. You might see something get put into a warning state, and then when you resolve it and you zoom back out, it still shows as warning. This can be a little bit painful, but there are other ways to sort of navigate through that. You can always save the graph, open it back up once you've cleaned out the warning, and the warning should no longer be there on the reopen, and that does force a whole refresh, which is quite nice. Also, I find that every once in a while, that's good for just keeping the Dynamo virtual machine up and running, which is pretty good. Warnings and errors can also be cycled through by clicking on the run menu. We demoed that in the What's New session 2 weeks ago, last week. I can't remember when we did that, but we'll show it again today just because it's such a fun feature.
Cool. So that is zoom states is kind of like the quick hit. It gives you like a snapshot or a macro view, a bird's eye view of what's going on in your graph to get you there really quickly. And that's awesome. You can actually click on the little run toggle buttons at the bottom to cycle through them quickly. But if you want a more in-depth, nuanced view, you can use the Graph Node Manager, which again, we've touched upon in the past, but wanted to reiterate here. So it's around management of your nodes and your graph space. And it's an extension that lives on the sidebar panel that in essence allows you to understand all of the states that are at play inside of any given node in the canvas. It enables you to search for nodes in the canvas. It enables you to zoom to fit on those nodes when you select them. You can search by renamed nodes. You can search and filter by all of these different categories. And it shows a table of all of these different types or states or issues or outputs that associate with these nodes. And some of these are things that, well, almost all of these things are expressed in different ways on the node itself. And this is sort of a catchment area for all of them. So for example, you have the ability to go and understand at a glance for any given node what has inputs, what has outputs, what is in a frozen state or a function state, what is returning nulls or returning empty lists, because that's important for you to debug. What is also potentially in an error state or in a warning state, or maybe even has an info state associated to it. And you get that all at a glance, which is kind of cool. You have the ability here to also copy and paste to clipboard or to export to CSV file, all of the states and the warnings that they're in. And it gives you the ability to essentially navigate through your graph space really quickly. Clicking on any single node does zoom to fit on them too, which is kind of fun to zoom around the canvas.
Yeah, the ability to copy the error message is so helpful in terms of troubleshooting. In particular, I can't tell you how many times I've opened up a Dynamo forum post and try to help somebody out and like, oh, that's a new warning. Let me see if I can type it from that message. What? Okay, yeah. And then you 5 minutes to type the error message, and you give it a Google, and oh, well, that's pretty quick and pretty simple. To be able to copy and paste that is going to save a ton of time. So really looking forward to that as more users take advantage of this feature. And next up, we've got our square pegs fitting in the round holes. This is, we're talking about it before, but pre-filtering your content to make sure that you're sort of removing the stuff that you don't want as you go. There are a few different ways to do that. I've put a couple of them up on screen here, but basically, as we move between different data sets, you might see different problems. Some of the common ones that we see all the time are unplaced or unbound rooms, geometry that won't extract, locations that don't extract, etc. These can be accounted for by sort of pulling the data, trying to get the content out, and then saying, hey, if this is null, filter that out of the list. You can do so with list.filter by bool mask or list.remove if not as needed, or list filter. Note that, remember, when you pull that initial value, if it's element.get location and it doesn't have a location, you're going to get an error message. You may want to suppress that with warning, function passing. You might want to suppress that warning that way. That's a great way to deal with it in that case, because we're actually going to use that function to sort of do the filtering, which can be pretty cool. You might also want to try and constrain the original selection. There's a select model element by category node now in Revit. I think we have similar nodes in Civil 3D as well. Or you could just do your selection after isolating in view. That's one actually very common way. I used to do a lot of stuff back when I was practicing that way, where I'd set the view up, make sure I had what I wanted, isolate the elements in view, and then do select model elements or all elements in active view to quickly gather just the stuff that I can see to make sure I wasn't processing something I didn't want to. Really great thing about that is you can actually reduce the runtime too, because you've just got a smaller data set to work with as opposed to the large collection of, I don't know, every curtain panel in your entire project, as opposed to the 5 that you want to work with, let's say.
Yeah, this is like the human piece of the filtering rather than the filtering inside of Dynamo. So this is a concept that we've talked about in the past. It's like, going to the well and only getting the bits that you need. Like, going to the well once, getting information once, and actually only getting exactly what you need at any one time. Going to keep your graph performing at a much better rate.
Yep.
All right, Dynamo Groupies, for all of the annotation lovers amongst us, including myself. So graph annotations, incredibly powerful for curating a legible and descriptive Dynamo graph. So we kind of talked upon this a little bit already, but this is the slide to dictate all of the cool things that you can do, or some of the cool things that you can do. So groups, which we have in the upper corner, allow you to logically group together like parts of your graph that are really easily identifiable parts, the things that go together. And the cool thing about groups is that A, they're awesome, but B, you can also set styles to define your own standards. So maybe as an office, you want to have a color scheme that represents your company, or maybe the out-of-the-box colors just jar on you for some reason and you want to set your own. You can totally do this with group styles, and you can apply today both a color and a font size, and in the future we will expand this to set other aspects of groups. You can also just use the ability to add in any kind of color, as you have done forever, sort of in a more ad hoc or on-demand method. Liberal use of notes as well also explains the why of your choices. We touched upon this in slide number 1, and it's really instrumental to explain what you're trying to do as a log for yourself and as a log for other people. The future you being probably the primary user of your graph in the future, and you will want to be able to understand that graph. So rigorous and robust usage of groups and notes and other annotation features like pinned wires and so on will help you have a more clear and legible graph to actually explore and explain to yourself at speed. The higher a graph gets in terms of node count, sort of the 1 to 3 to 400 node range, if you get that far, it becomes infinitely harder to actually understand. So breaking that down through, say, collapsed groups, or breaking that down through like a bespoke custom node that you ship in a robust way is a better way to start managing the content from an understanding perspective.
Absolutely. All right. Without further ado, let's get into the live demo. All right. You can see I've got Dynamo open here. I have a lovely broken graph. We've done some horrible things to this poor little graph, as we can all see. Very much fell through the ringer. Now, I do see graphs like this every once in a while. Usually it's a sign of somebody has an add-in which is causing a conflict, typically a Revit add-in. That's causing a conflict in the context of Dynamo for Revit, or Dynamo for Civil, or Dynamo for something else, which is preventing the JSON from deserializing correctly. So if you ever get a graph like this, find out who you got it from and say, hey, I think we might need to check in on your Revit add-ins to make sure that they're not causing a conflict. Obviously, check your own before you go pointing the finger somewhere else. But once that's done, we can start to try and put it together. So there is actually a really handy tip so that we can start to take that big picture and identify the flow. What you can do is you can select all of these nodes with just one big crossing bar or Control A on the keyboard. And once all of those are selected, come on. Okay, maybe Control A doesn't want to work for me right now. Oh, it's just being very slow. We're going to come up in here, click on the edit menu, and then just say clean up node layout or Control L, and suddenly things get much cleaner, right? We can instantly start to see exactly what it is that's happening here, and we can try and leverage this for other work along the way. Now, I still haven't. Go ahead.
Jacob, just interrupt for a hot second. John said it shouldn't need to select all, and that is true. So if you just do Control L on your graph, it'll take the entire context and do this. If you make a sub-selection, it'll actually only sort of clean up the node layout of that sub-selection. If you select a group and clean up node layout on that, it'll only clean up within the group. So it's a little bit contextual, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. Great point. Thanks, John and Sol. From there, now that we've got our initial sort of node layout run, we can see we've got a node that's in an error state down here. We can come and look and try and figure out exactly what's happening. We were taking X and Y, and it looks like we had X double division sign, which is going to turn that into a comment. That's probably my issue, so we can go ahead and hit that. That error has now gone away, and now we can start to actually hit run and see what happens. So we'll hit run, and instantly all sorts of warning state nodes. Again, zooming out and looking at how they are all sort of set up, we can also sort of cycle through them. This is going to sort of bring us to those individual nodes. We're a bit far out, so let me zoom way in. You can see it's going to center each one of those nodes, and it's also selecting them as we go, which is, again, pretty handy. The other tool to have a look at here is we can go into our graph node manager. And when I use this, I typically like a good amount of real estate on this one. This is one of those view extensions. A lot of them I like to keep really narrow, but Graph Node Manager, for whatever reason, I just feel like it works better when it's really big. So from here, we can all see, is the node rename? It's got our individual bubble. Is the what type of node? Is it a function? Is it sort of regular processing? We can check out the different node states, any issues the node might have, whether or not the node has outputs, so on and so forth. So output issues, so on and so forth. So from here, we can start to filter stuff out. Is anything generating an empty list? Well, no, it's not. Is anything generating null? Well, quite a bit. And those tend to also have issues with them, and we could start to cycle through that as desired. For now, let's go ahead and let's isolate our warnings. And we'll click on a few of these and sort of see kind of how they're parsing through. Now, this doesn't necessarily have any indication in terms of the order of execution, because it does sort of allow sorting a few different ways. If I were to try and clean up a big graph like this, the first thing I would do, as I mentioned before, is I'd start all the way on the left. So let's actually go over there. Question in the chat, is Graph Node Manager available only in the latest version of Dynamo, say Revit 2024, or is it impossible to install it separately? Sol, any idea on that one?
So it is available from Dynamo 2.15 onwards, and it has gone through like some improvements through that, and we have one more set of quality of life things to improve on it. So 2.15, I believe, was Revit 2023.1, the release that came through, so it should be available from then. It is not, unfortunately, available to download on the package manager for earlier versions, but it is fully baked in from 2.15 onwards.
Yep, so get 2023 updated and you should have access to it. All right, so no problem. So now we've identified our leftmost node. That's this one right here, ellipse by coordinate system radii. And let's go ahead and let's look into this error message. Now, anytime we get a warning, we do have that learn more link right there. We click on it, it will bring us into our documentation browser. Documentation browser is super helpful to find out what's going on with the node, or in this case, why a warning has been sort of produced. So this, we can read through. The error message indicates it was expecting nodes of a different type of input than it received. So an example of that would be element set parameter value by name to sort of get the wrong piece, or geometry bounding box, try using element bounding box, a few different ways around it, a few different ways to fix it. What I do when I see this is I hover over my inputs, look at what the expected data type is. So this is a double. That's definitely a type of double right there. My x-axis, also a double, getting a double there. My origin, that's expecting a coordinate system. Well, I'm currently providing a point by coordinates node. Okay, well, that's not really going to work too well. So this is where we might want to look at sort of maybe doing some kind of error handling. So let's try putting that Python up on screen. And we'll go ahead and build similar to what we had before. So we need to import C types. And the first thing I need to do is—
Are you building that?
Yeah.
John has the other option, which is only a Dynamo Revit option to use task.show. So we are in Sandbox, which requires the C types method right now.
Yep.
There's probably many other methods that you could use.
So we're going to declare object is equal to in1 if object dot underscore underscore class underscore underscore is not equal to point C types. I can type dot win DLL dot win32 dot message box W. I can't remember. Let's go back and let's check. Right up here, message box. Oh, it's user 32, not 132. Message box, capital B, W, capital N message, 0, comma. Thanks, John. I mean, you're the one who's calling out Revit API from memory so maybe just different memory for each of us. So please provide coordinate system, and then incorrect data type provided. One, open that up, and then we'll just set out to be equal to our object. All right, so now when I run this, let's see what happens. Please provide coordinate system popped up right there. So any user who runs this is going to get that message. It's pretty in their face. It's not as in their face as it could be. Maybe we wanted something big and bold and flashing and some sort of animation with the Doge on it or something along those lines. But we can now wire this in. And that's going to consistently pop up that data while passing through what we had before. So we'll still get that other content. Now we do need a coordinate system. We're going to use a coordinate system by origin node to fix this error here. And let's see what happens when I do this. I'm going to change this over to coordinate system.
This one is always really tricky to spell.
Yep. Okay, so we've got our coordinate system passed through. We've got our ellipse. Let's see where our next issue is. Oh, math.floor doesn't have an input, so we've got a problem here. And now this is where our Control-L sort of shortcut may have backfired a little bit, right? Because this is trying to take that X and this Y, which looks like it's actually set up to be an input. So let's pull this all the way over here. Didn't mean to grab those as well. And the result on this actually wants to wire into that math.floor. Now, it's unlikely that you would see something sort of configured in exactly this way. I'm going to go ahead and just clean up this bit of node layout here. And we've moved stuff quite a long ways around. I'm going to try and pull my inputs over. Anytime we've got a node with inputs, it's best to try and keep our inputs pretty well grouped together. So I've got another one here and another one here.
Good candidate for a group.
It is a really good candidate for a group. I like where your head's at. So I do tend to use, when I'm doing sort of my initial cleanup, I do tend to use my alt commands to be able to do this. Monocle has some great features for that. I've uninstalled all my packages to try and do that, so I don't have Monocle on here right now, but I highly recommend that one, John. It is an amazing contribution to the community, so thank you so much for that. Now let's see what we've got. Next warning is all the way down here. The value used in a range expression must be a number or letter. Well, okay, so it's really tough to debug code blocks, in particular when they've got multiple inputs. So always make sure we kind of understand everything that's coming in. We've got solids, so we've got a list of colors. At this point, I would typically put a watch node on canvas and find out, are the individual pieces that we're calling for actually processing something through? So we've got colors being created. We've got a list of two indices, 0 and 1. That's created correctly. So that means this must be the only error. Now, 0.1 divided by 0, division by 0 makes infinity, right? We can't have that. That's going to be out of range. I'm going to go ahead and remove that, run once more. And now we're all the way through and creating our geometry color. So let's see if we can see where that is on screen. There it is. It's much larger than I had previously assumed it would be. Perhaps my
because I made it in metric
in millimeters, I'm guessing. But there we go. That's the first part of the cleanup. We could hand this off to the user and they'd be good to go, right? I wouldn't recommend doing that though, right? Don't just be like, okay, the problem solved, let's move on to the next problem. No, take the time to finish cleaning this up. Take the time to get our documentation together. So we've got some wires that are kind of going crazy along through here. So let's see if we can put some pins in place. There's one, add a pin, and whoop, I'm going to pull that down here. That looks pretty good. Let's add another pin onto this wire.
You can also right click, there's a new access point to pin wire. If you don't want to wait the like 0.3 seconds or 0.25 seconds it takes on hover.
Yeah.
The reason that exists is because you don't want to have stuff bopping all over the show when you're just moving your cursor across the graph. But we also have an issue with the snapping, which we need to resolve.
Yeah, the snapping I think is probably the bigger issue personally. I can never manage to get this.
If you zoom in, it's easier, but it shouldn't have to be zoomed in.
The other way to do it is just to hide the wire. Maybe not the best way. It is still available. If we highlight it, it will show up, which is pretty handy. maybe not the most useful. This is a difficult one to trace, so I probably would want to make sure I get a pin on this one.
Just do the right click. It's easier.
Here we go. Make sure we can easily identify what our logic flows are, where they're coming from, how they're moving through. Take all of these and shift them down a bit. Might have
Yeah,
one,
Control
two.
L will get you part of the way, but
Yeah,
it's not
there is
perfect
still
by any stretch.
Yeah, there is still some degree of manual cleanup that's required. All right, now let's try this one more time. Means I can show this one again. That's looking pretty good. And now we're into our grouping phase. So I always like to keep all my inputs grouped together. We'll highlight all of these, create group. Create a group here. Create a group here. So on and so forth. In the interest of time, we've got 10 minutes left. I guess I could just keep creating groups if people find that interesting. But that's pretty much where we're at now. One other
The
thing.
point is made.
Yeah, the one other thing to do would be perhaps to add some notes to sort of describe.
The client wanted an elliptical stare. Thus,
Yes.
we use an elliptical stare through ellipse by coordinate system radii.
Yep. We can go ahead, add some notes, pin the notes to the nodes to make sure that they're there. Great feature, also super useful for sort of help for your inputs if you were going to run this through Dynamo Player or Generative Design.
Jot is shouting out groups within groups and graph properties and collapse groups while we're at it.
Yes, groups within groups we'll get to here in a second. We'll start with collapse groups. Let's actually add all of this. Let's pretend, make a group for this. And then a group for this. And let's say we wanted both of these inside a larger group that said, and now from here we can start to collapse individual groups or the parent group. You will get some interesting results around sort of pinned stuff that doesn't exist anymore when you start to do that. It is a known bug, as Sol, I think, started to speak up to say. But baby steps, as we like to say, as we get even better and better. Then from here, we'll go and do extension and get into our graph properties. From here, we can start to add information to this graph, such as the description. Each tread, there we go. Image, handy tip for the image. If you're looking for a great way to get some nice graphics, set the graph the way that you like it. Go to your geometry preview, and then you can just do export as image, background 3D preview. and then save your image. I should probably also save my graph.
So while you're doing that, Jacob, Sean's calling out, it would be cool to grab a predefined group style and grouping. Definitely. If you have some really robust logic on how I should pick that, then please let me know.
Yes. Fill out the author if you had to learn more URL. Go ahead and put this in here. You can also add custom properties to this. Go ahead and name the custom property and then set what you want those values to be. You can, if you have a large library, I do have a forum post to sort of help generate this content in bulk across all of your graphs. I posted that up onto the Dynamo forum. It's going to take me a minute to find that though. Give me 1 second. Here we go. So this post here, and I will put the link in the chat for anybody who wants it, has one zip file attached to it, which has been renamed to .txt. Gonna have to rename that. From there, we can bulk resize graphs, remove bindings, add properties in bulk or individually, if node replacement, Python engine changer, input renamer, graph tracker, build testing journals, and a tracker file, which really you'd want to replace with your own. John Pearson also has an amazing tool to sort of help with some of these other issues like graph resizing that he's built. It is in beta that he's also just put the link in the chat to the Graph Migration Assistant. We'll go ahead and we'll open that to give people the sneak peek at that. John, is that fully baked at this point, or are you still making some changes on that one?
Testing for now.
Testing for now. So yes, go ahead and play around with that, see if you like it, and we can go from there. All right. With 8 minutes to spare, does anybody have any questions or anything else? Run in sandbox for now too. Great, great advice on that one. Yeah, run that in sandbox, a later build as well.
Any difficult questions for us? Hit us with your best one. John's trying to ask us to do math on the fly. 2 to the power of 13. Jokes. All right. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat or feel free to come off. Otherwise, we'll continue down the tail end of our presentation. Is it a graph or a script? It's whatever you want it to be. As long as other people know what you're talking about, it doesn't really matter. I use both, if that helps. And I write blog posts that actually use both.
It's an automation tool.
Yeah, okay, cool. So thank you all so much for joining today. We have a sort of 4 more sessions that would essentially round out the whole narrative arc that Jacob and I had put together around different pieces of the puzzle for Dynamo. And we have some awesome special guests coming out for the final 4 in the series. We have Patrick helping us get on the same page, which is about making sure that standardization piece that we alluded to and touched upon today gets into the right kind of flow. We have Mr. John Pearson on the call today, helping us as our special guest for discovering a new environment, where we start to talk about IDEs or development environments, specifically the ones to do with Zero Touch, which is coming up after that with Zachary Jensen, who has actually just joined Autodesk. His first day was 2 days ago on the Civil 3D side. He is the author of the Canva package. And we also have finally teaming up with a team, which is the ability for you to submit a PR or a pull request, which means code, to the Dynamo code base and understand exactly what it takes to essentially get that to be accepted as a viable piece of, or a viable addition to the Dynamo landscape with Michael Kirchner, who is one of the developers on our team. Thanks, John. I agree. Big coup on that front to get Zachary to join. Unfortunately, he's not working on Dynamo, but he will be tangential and helping us out. So without further ado, I think that's it. Off to you, Tiana, to tail us off.
Yeah, so thank you all for joining. Hopefully I think I froze there for a second, but thank you all for joining. These are other ways to get involved in the community. If you want to submit your own proposal for a community conversation, we also are always looking for more hosts and things like that. And then obviously on the other side, we have all of our socials that you can go and get involved in and things like that. As I said earlier, this was recorded, so a recording of this will be up on the site that you guys used to register for, as well as on YouTube. And I think that is it. So thank you all for joining, and I will let Saul and Jacob have the last word.
Yes, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody. It's a blast as always. Looking forward to getting into sort of management in zero touch soon after.